Hi, hello, and welcome, or welcome back, I suppose. We're now on the final review of our read up to Halloween. I was kind of nervous that I'd be ending this on a bum note, but thank God I have been blessed. I have read one of Richard Matheson's books before, unsurprisingly, that being I Am Legend, which I loved. It was a really interesting take on the idea of both vampires and zombies, because the creatures in that book are sort of both, but we're going into a different realm of horror today with a good old-fashioned haunting with Hell House by Richard Matheson. Spoilers ahead, and we will be covering sexual topics along with some gross bloody stuff. Not really going into the gross bloody stuff, but obviously that is a feature of the book. And to be clear, the two not wholly related, sort of in one area, certainly not in my review, and I will get on to why that is not going to be a complaint. This isn't a sort of, oh my god, this is weird graphic nasty sex stuff. We will get on to that in a minute though. Belasco House, also known as Hell House, is one of the most haunted houses in the state. There have been 2 expeditions to it previously to try to get to the bottom of what's happening and to stop it. The first left no survivors, and the second in 1940 left 2. One was institutionalized, and the other was a 16-year-old spiritual medium prodigy called Ben Fisher. 30 years later, a small team is hired to go back one more time, comprised of Fisher, now 46, and no longer with any real connection to his abilities, by his own choice. We also have Florence Tanner, a spiritual medium in her own right. She is very connected to her spirituality and to her faith in God. To her, the mediumship is a gift from him. Finally, we have Dr. Lionel Barrett and his wife Edith, who often serves as his assistant with his work in parapsychology. He does not believe in ghosts in the sense that they are the reanimated spirits of the dead, but does believe that there is some force and energy that causes the phenomena of so-called hauntings. While the 4 of them may not always agree on the cause of these goings-on, they do agree that whatever it is needs to be stopped, and the man who hired them has given them 1 week to do so. One thing I will say about this book is that it is only of its time in the sense of writing style and dynamics with characters, and a little something I'll get on with later in regards to that. But I was surprised and found it refreshing to read a book from 71 that has no real issues regarding outdated ideals, especially given the nature of the haunting. In fact, all things considered, it's pretty progressive. And I know 1971 isn't that long ago, but if an author were even to write this story today, it could still come out way worse in terms of the subject matter. This story, like the story being told here, is absolutely dependent on the fact that it has been written with an author who cares about how to write it. So the nature of the haunting is regarding the depraved sexual nature of the man who owned the house, Belasco. He was a Marquis de Sade type, and the house was a pit of sexual sin. One of the first rooms they explore is a chapel, quote unquote. There's a crucifix on the wall with Jesus affixed to it, except this Jesus is hung like a horse and stiff as a board. So that gives you an idea of the sordid nature of the place. There's also all sorts of crude sexual acts around the displayed around the chapel, and I was nervous about how the sexual aspects would play into the horror, but I didn't have to worry at all. There are scenes that are uncomfortable, but nothing that feels like someone using sexual assault as a shock factor. For example, a few times Edith is sort of taken over by the presence within the house, and she is overcome with lust. It's clear that she's always had some general sexual repression, and there is a bit of an iffy explanation for that later, but the point is she hasn't ever had the opportunity to be a sexual being. Lionel suffered with polio and has some baggage of his own, meaning that the two of them have never really slept with one another. And she has also been repressing the fact that she does have an interest in women, seen first when she's helping Florence prepare for some of Lionel's tests. And it isn't made perfectly clear whether she is interested in men at all, or if she has just generalized repressed sexual feelings. But when she's taken over by this presence, it is rather shocking and kind of darkly funny, like in that way where it's like, because you're shocked, you have to stifle a giggle a little bit. Like twice she makes a rather intense move on Fisher, which is not reciprocated at all, and she is caught fully nude trying to make her move on Fisher by her husband. And it becomes one of those things where it's like, we can talk about this later when it's all over. It's very awkward, but it's not grotesque. The same can be said for when she really tries it on with her husband in a steam room. She's straddling him and kind of just yelling at him to quote unquote make it hard, and it is uncomfortable. And I giggled a little bit, but like, as much as anything, it's uncomfortable because of secondhand embarrassment. She isn't able to get anywhere with these actions, and it's just awkward. It's so awkward. At no point did I feel like anyone in these scenes was being taken advantage of beyond the haunting aspect. Yes, deeply uncomfortable all around, but it never felt like a malicious act of sexual violence in any regard. Now, I will say that Matheson sort of implies that she has a love for women because of an assault committed by her father when she was a young girl. Now, her general repressed sexuality could well be linked to that, but this is raised in specific while talking about repressed lesbianism or sort of repressed sapphic feelings. I don't have a huge amount of flags raised when it comes to maybe kind of archaic takes about this kind of thing or in general with this book, but I did raise my eyebrows at that. But as well as Edith's actions, we also have some moments with Florence. Now, yes, I am aware that it is mostly related to women, but let's be clear, it does also include the men. Like, we bring up the fact that Lionel is kind of impotent, and to me, it reads like when the way that Fisher responds to Edith is that of a man who is just like dealing with the trauma of the house from when he was 16, not in a sexual manner, but it is clear that he knows what's happening and there's nothing he can do to stop it, and it is all related to the sexuality of it. And also it does link to the fact that we have these two women, one of whom is a kind of repressed housewife and the other is a very godly woman, so it does make sense. And you can do readings into it in terms of how progressive or non-progressive it is, that it's only the women that really deal with that kind of sexual stuff, but I will not be dealing with that here because that's not something I was considering too much while reading. It's not something that stuck out as this feels like particular sexual violence towards women, and that's just because it's sort of a generalized depravity rather than targeted. But like I said, we also have some moments with Florence that could have been very different were they handled by somebody else, and I genuinely am rather grateful for the way that Matheson dealt with it. Throughout, Florence is convinced that there is a spirit in the house by the name of Daniel Bolesco, bastard son of the man who owned the house. He slowly wormed his way in with her and got to the point where he seems to have convinced her that him possessing her is going to help free him from the clutches of his awful, awful father. They do this by way of him having sex with her, but it doesn't quite go the way she has planned. She thought this would be a loving act, given the bond she sort of thinks she has with the spirit. Effectively, in her head, she thinks this is going to be a kind of Patrick Swayze moment. It is very clear to anybody looking at this that something is going to go wrong, but it's hard to tell in what way. But instead, as she lays beneath this spirit preparing for entry, she closes her eyes, takes a deep breath and looks up to see something far more startling than she expected. The figure of a decaying corpse is now above her, fully just rotten, zombie-esque, and we see nothing of the following act. Barring this thing, we see the fact that it enters her and she screams as it does so, but we do not then see her again until the others are able to break into her room and it is clear that she is no longer herself. And don't get me wrong, the moment we saw the corpse to the point where she reveals the possession by saying that she has been quote unquote filled, I was obviously incredibly unnerved and uncomfortable, but not in such a way that made me dislike the book. I was feeling the way you're supposed to feel with horror. Matheson gives us this deep discomfort of having that act happen, but does us the service of not really showing it. Implication does a lot of heavy lifting here, and the horror on the page is the presence of the corpse and the way she behaves in the aftermath, not the act itself. I think there's a lot of consideration for the reader there, which a lot of horror authors, especially men in the genre, wouldn't have given. And Florence's final moments are in the chapel. She goes out kicking and screaming, getting an incredible exit, steadfast in her beliefs, and even finds a way to help the others in her final moments. There are, again, implications of what happened with the well-hung Jesus on the cross, and the aftermath is a little bit graphic, but once again it isn't told to us in such a way that implies glee in telling us this, even if such glee is just in shocking the reader. We see that there is, I don't want to go into too much detail with this because it is uncomfortable, but again, it is supposed to be. We see that there is blood on the cross, and not on the cross, on the phallus, and we see that where the phallus has been is not in a particularly pleasant state, and I believe we see when it falls on her there is an implication of where it is, but it's not graphically described in any kind of way. So many, like, you know, when I read Lapvona, where it really goes into detail in things like that, and I've read other stuff, or I've watched things like Game of Thrones, where it's just like, listen, as an act, it makes sense. And I was nervous because of the sexual nature of the haunting of this place. I was so scared that this would be set up that way so we could have some, oh, aren't you shocked by the fact that this terrible thing is happening? And I love the way that Matheson handles it. Like, the sexual content of this book, no matter whether it is a consensual moment or just a strange moment, it is all still kind of shocking. But like I said, there is just clear consideration as to how it should be handled. If someone is going to include sexual topics in their horror, then they do well to give this book a read. I mean, quite frankly, this is just fantastic, a fantastic quintessential haunted house book. Like I was talking about earlier with the idea of the dynamics between the characters, they are relatively sort of expected, but they're done really well, so it doesn't feel trite. And frankly, to me, this being out in 71 means that part of that is that it wasn't quite as stereotypical then. Like, don't get me wrong, ghost stories having been around for so fucking long, but the way it's set up with this, with the scientific aspect of it, like the idea of, like, if I recall from other dives into horror that I've seen, the concept of things like parapsychology, bringing science together with the supernatural, was a huge thing in, I think, the late 60s, early 70s. And this obviously falls in line with that perfectly. It came out in 1971, but if I'm wrong about my timing there, I'm happy to be corrected. But I feel like there was a bunch of parapsychology stuff going on in that era. I feel like there were genuine studies being done and that kind of thing. And obviously that shows itself in horror media, be it on film, in books, that kind of thing. So the dynamic and the kind of skepticism of, is it ghosts, is it some of the energy, that kind of thing, it does feel a bit like we've seen this before, but how much was that being seen pre, like, late 60s, early 70s? And while we have a lot on the side of this just being run-of-the-mill ghosts, there is credence lent to Barrett's theory that this is all just residue electromagnetic energy. This place is so wrought with haunting because when the residents were active in their debauchery, that was going to create an abundance of this energy. The lasting energy idea is one that I've seen previously, and it does make a lot of sense, and it does fit in really well here. Mediums and spiritualists can sort of tap into this energy, but it also emits from them, thus creating physical manifestations. And as the book progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that nobody is right on their own. It all has to work together. It's been a case of Florence and Barrett both being incredibly single-minded in their own beliefs, and unfortunately it takes them both dying for anything to be done about that. Edith wants to stand by her husband's beliefs, but finds it incredibly difficult, and Fisher is so scared of opening himself up to the house again after his first visit there. He may be 46 now, but some wounds are really hard to heal, and as with Florence, the way Barrett is killed off works incredibly. While it's not the case that he gets to go out kicking and screaming as she did, it does just follow the way his character has been going since the start. Even down to the location, because it is a place where he's been happy to... He's been talking about the pool since the beginning. And while Florence was steadfast in her beliefs, we could see far more as to why she believed what she did. Plus, while it is likely that this is to do with her possession, there were signs that she understood that her and Barrett's beliefs were not opposing, but rather separate parts of a greater whole. With Barrett, it felt frustrating at times, like he had his beliefs so he wouldn't see anything else. Very much dealing with like tunnel vision. It was all about the strict science of it all, with him basically filling the role of the skeptic we often see within all kinds of ghost stories. In the end, his death was him being shown a kind of truth. He hadn't been wrong in that the machine he brought to deal with the haunting did make a difference, but it wasn't enough. If, after a clear haunting incident in the steam room, he'd have been a little more receptive to Florence's ideas, they not only both likely would have survived, but they also would have been able to fully put a stop to this much sooner. But instead, they played into Belasco's hands by butting heads in the way that they did. And I do love the way this rounds out. It's a classic ghost story feature where we get the pieces that have been breadcrumbed to us throughout all brought together in a neat explanation. This is a pretty common feature of this kind of story, and it's clear Matheson actually understands that these are to tie things together from what we already have. It's a way to go, here's all the pieces that you could have put together yourself, and probably have been putting together yourself, and here's just a tight, neat explanation of it. Maybe tying up some questions that you've not been able to fully answer for yourself. It is not a way to shoehorn in an explanation that comes from out of nowhere. Plain bad heroines. It's in the final moments where we also see Fisher's character arc really reach a wonderful conclusion. We've seen him once before in this novel, during this trip to the house while he's in his 40s, opening himself up to the house. But the spirits were too overwhelming for him, and he felt sure he wouldn't be able to be of any real use beyond the knowledge he could provide from the last time he was there, and he really just felt like he was a handyman, really. But in the end, he gains physical, mental, and spiritual strength, and is able to take Belasco down, ridding himself of that which has been haunting him as much as the house. For the past 30 years, he realizes that Belasco is the way he is, mostly due to ego, and thanks to that, he knows that he is far weaker than he seems, because ego is always burstable. He is able to rid himself of Belasco, but he's also able to connect to his spirituality in a way that he hasn't been able to for the past 30 years. And I have a real fondness for Fisher. I had throughout the entire novel, but something about his character had me feeling so warmed to him, and seeing him with this burst of confidence facing this wretch head on was just wonderful. And honestly, it had my heart flutter a little bit. listen, he's so full of heart, and it's just... Any kind of happy ending in a horror book can be incredibly difficult to pull off, but Matheson manages it, and to be fair, it probably is a case of it working so well because it's kind of bittersweet, given the deaths of half the team. And I do think, if you've never read Hell House before, then you need to get on it. This should be far more of a classic than it seems to be. Quite rightly, Matheson is known for I Am Legend, but we should hold this in high regard too, quite frankly. The horror is incredible, and I was often left with chills, and some of the more visceral moments of this book had me needing to just, like, take a minute. It's brilliant, just brilliant. But... that being said, that brings us to the end of our read up to Halloween. On the big spooky day itself, I'll be bringing you a little roundup of everything I've read for the season, going over the high and low points. And then next week, I am onto The Miniaturist, I think. Yeah, I'm onto The Miniaturist. It's a book I started, got like a fair way through, and for whatever reason I just never finished it. I assume I was reading this at the end of a summer, so I started my next year of college, or I started uni or whatever, because I remember reading this around that kind of time. So it was probably just a case of, oh, I'll finish this at some point, and then I just got busy with studies. But I'm finally sorting myself out now and getting it read, and also releasing myself of horror for a bit, because I do need a break. But let me know what horror books you think should be considered classics that aren't like this one. And also, let me know your favourite Halloween reads this year down in the comments below. Also, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and feel free to ring that notification bell. All the cringe shit I'm supposed to ask you to do in my videos. But most importantly, I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful night, a wonderful whenever you are watching this. Take good care of yourself. Right.